first time, so I'm a bit nervous. So am I doing the right thing? Anyone? I think I am live. It tells me I am live. Hello, everyone. So welcome, everyone, again for my book launch for the other goddess, Mary Magdalene and the goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge. Oops, this is the book. And as I said, this is my first live stream, so I'm just struggling here with technology. But for these people who are here already or who are going to watch it in the future, I would like to thank you for joining me not on this journey, because many of you were on this journey with me for quite a while. So I will just start talking about the writing process. So this book was actually a very transformational time for me, simply because since I was very young, I wanted to be a writer, and even whether I was in Poland or in France, I learned 100 English words, in 100 words in English, to fulfill this dream. And in the past, although I've been published in the past, I attached too much importance, I think, to this process. And this time something happened. I realized that I was completely enslaved. I was completely enslaved by the idea that I have to fulfill other people's expectations. And in my case, it was expectations of the literary world or academic world. And with this book, something happened. I just completely, hi, Satira, good to see you. So, and I realized I just decided to go for it. I just decided to, instead of worrying what anybody thinks, because I will tell you later, this book in some parts is very personal, and I just decided to go for it. So I wrote the book that wanted to be written, rather than I thought what people are going to think about me. So for those of you who already bought the book or planning to buy the book, I would like to thank you so much for supporting me on this journey, because it was a very tumultuous journey. So I know it is kind of wrong way, shows on the camera, but this is a beautifully produced book, The Other Goddess, Mary Magdalene and the Goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge. And the cover actually was based on the painting by Shiloh Sophia, who is a very prolific and a beautiful artist from California. I'm very grateful for this cover. So thank you so much for this, Shiloh. And I see some people are already putting some notes, so thank you. If you have any questions, let me know. And I'll just start with the description of the book, in case you wonder, do you want to see the book and to actually have it? So you see also behind me, there's a book here. So apart from being beautifully produced, I hope that it is also a very entertaining book, because this was my goal, actually, to write about alternative theories about Mary Magdalene and spirituality and sexuality, also the archetypes of other goddesses who I believe possessed a secret knowledge and use the Eros and sexuality also to enhance that knowledge. So it is not only about Mary Magdalene. So I think I will start basically explaining my book. So in part one is very personal. So I can already see some people saying, oh, she doesn't mention Mary Magdalene to part two. And it is true, because part one is really about my own personal journey towards Eros. And that I always perceived Eros in a kind of spiritual way. So I go through the archetypes of different goddesses that I encountered first in my childhood, which is basically the Greek goddesses, such as Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and wisdom. And I explain what happened to Aphrodite, because she eventually started to lose her power. So she was born as a powerful goddess, and eventually, in a relationship with men, interestingly, she completely loses her power. And this is something that I observed in many relationships with very powerful and exciting women. What happens? There's some kind of balance. We are out of balance, and we don't know often how to find ourselves in our relationships. Then in part one also, I discovered my journey. It was basically a spiritual journey. I went to Asia and I started to meet tantric teachers. And originally it had nothing to do with sexuality. I own a lot to these teachings. But I met some Sanskrit scholars. And at a certain stage in my life, especially when I already lived in Melbourne, Australia, I started to attend sessions with a Sanskrit scholar who was also a Catholic priest, a Buddhist monk, and a Swami, and I also brought my yoga teacher to this class, and we started to study the Kula ritual, which is a famous tantric work, Tantra Loka, or the Light on Tantras, where I started to learn more about the tantric part of the teachings, especially the use of sexuality for attaining expanded consciousness. And it just happened that, which was a very spontaneous experience in my case, that I actually experienced expansion of consciousness, through erotic act with another man. So this is actually, I describe it in quite detail in my book. So this is the first part of my book, talks about my own journey towards Eros and secret knowledge. And I go to different traditions and other people's experiences as well. Part two is really the part that talks about Mary Magdalene. And in part two starts with me actually being in a church of Mary Magdalene, a Russian Orthodox church in Jerusalem, when I saw this beautiful painting of Mary Magdalene, where she is not portrayed as a sinner, but she is portrayed with her hand extended, and in her hand she has something like a fruit or an egg. Traditionally, it is called an egg. And this image really impacted me because she's shown there as a powerful person. And it brought to my memory images of other goddesses from my deep past, such as, for example, Sumerian goddess, very ancient goddess, 4,000 years BC, that she is portrayed exactly in the same way, except that her portrayal is a little bit more detailed. She's actually portrayed as sitting next to the tree of life and knowledge, and she extends the fruit of life and knowledge to humanity, to a male person on the other side of the carving. And this reminded me very much of this particular painting of Mary Magdalene. So when I returned back to Australia, I started to research other goddesses that, perhaps had similar imagery and had similar connections to this, to Nimna and Mary Magdalene. Are there any goddesses in between? And I found that yes, indeed, Inanna, a goddess from about 2,500 years BC, who is portrayed with the same symbolism, and also she's often portrayed with the reed, which means she was like Nimna, and like, as we know, really, Mary Magdalene, who was a big, played a big part in resurrection story, is portrayed as a portal between dimensions, or the portal between death and life. So Nimna and Inanna are portrayed the same way. And then, Isis, of course, there's a famous story of Isis, how she resurrects her husband for a moment, Osiris, and conceived a child with him. And she's also portrayed as the goddess of resurrection, so to speak, although of its temporary resurrection. So in some ways, all of these goddesses had to go to the underworld, so to speak, and they find their way back, or they accompanied a male figure who was their partner from underworld to back to life, or to ascension, the way I see it. And in part two, I also go into the Gnostic writings about Mary Magdalene, because it confirmed my original feeling that she was not only a woman who was fully sexually awake as well, but a wise woman. And in the Gnostic Gospels, Mary Magdalene is portrayed as the favorite disciple of Jesus. And for example, in Pistis Sophia, which is basically a collection of questions that the disciples asked Jesus, she asked 39 or 42 questions. And it is quite interesting that in all Gnostic documents, all other disciples are jealous of her relationship with Jesus. So, this is this famous line that says, "Teacher, why do you love her more than us?" And it just kind of makes you smile, because you think, well, yes, he loved her more than you, perhaps because he had a special relationship with her. And so this is the Gnostic writings, and I don't want to go in great detail to this because it's all there, in the book, that basically says two things. She was the favorite disciple of Jesus, and also that they had a special connection, which was perhaps very intimate, because he called her in the Gospel of Philip his koinonos, which means basically his partner or his beloved. So it's I know that Margaret Starbert talks very eloquently about Mary Magdalene being the wife and of Jesus, and the mother of his children, and that's a good story. But what I am trying to say here, that we actually don't know this, but we seem to know that she was a woman of great wisdom, and that she had some very deep and special and probably intimate relationship with Jesus. But I do not want her to be boxed in again into the image of necessarily of the Holy Family, because we already had this figure of the Virgin Mary. So at least in my imagination, I see her in a more free relationship with Jesus, although I'm not sure how people are going to relate to this, right? So in part 2, I also look into history, not only other goddesses, but I looked into history of human history. Were there other women who carried this tradition, such as priestesses, and philosophers who carried this tradition of secret knowledge and Eros used for the purpose of sexual alchemy, so the use of sexual alchemy for the expansion of human consciousness. And I found many examples of them. So I actually relied on the work of another scholar, John E. Taylor, who made fantastic research about them. And for example, one of them is Themistoclea, which is actually, she was a Delphic oracle, an oracle from Delphi, and she was a teacher of the famous philosopher Pythagoras, who, apart from being a mathematician, started his own esoteric school. And even more importantly, I don't know if more importantly, but also importantly, his wife, Theano, was also a philosopher, and she was a part of this esoteric school. And after Pythagoras' death, she actually ran the school for him. Then there's Diotima, who is actually discussed in the dialogues of Plato, actually in the Symposium, and one more dialogue that I don't remember at the moment, which is quite interesting because there are hardly any women, in Plato's dialogues, simply because in Athens, women were not allowed to have this kind of discussions, and Plato himself had no interest in women. Hi, Todd, good to see you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I was just saying at the beginning how I want to thank everyone who accompanied me on this journey right from the beginning, and you were one of them. And I think Valerie was here as well. And so thank you for this. Thank you for this, and thank you for coming and keeping me company right now. So just, I know that you ordered the book. So I'm really happy because it's such a beautiful book. I mean, visually beautiful book. It's beautifully produced. So that's why if some of you are considering buying it, I think the paperback is probably better option, simply because how beautifully it is done. Somebody designed it very nicely. I'm very grateful to the publisher for this. So I was looking into this, and also, there's this interesting story in Athens about the heterae, which were the educated women who are considered a little bit like escorts nowadays, educated escorts. But there is a little bit of discussion there, because it seems that unless you're a mother and and married to an Athenian man, and then it means you were just in the kitchen, put away, you were not allowed to be educated and have discussions, then you were called heterae. That doesn't necessarily mean that you were a prostitute or you were a heterae, but because you stray away, so to speak, from what was allowed for a woman at the moment. Right. So it doesn't necessarily even mean that. It just means that women who chose a different path, and there are many examples there in my book that I give of women like that. And I think my actually favorite part in the whole book is the ending of part 2, where I talk about, I kind of have a vision of Mary Magdalene in ancient Alexandria, which was such a beautiful place where all knowledge from around the world basically met in one place, in one crossing, because of the Library of Alexandria and so on. So I imagine her going there after resurrection, and I have my own theory there, which I'll discuss in a moment, but I just want to see Freethinker. Oh, thank you, Freethinker. Thank you so much. That's so wonderful. I'm so glad you are here with me and with us, right? So I imagine her going to Alexandria because it actually, so it's kind of fictionalized moment when she arrives in Alexandria and she's met by a scribe who can basically write down her wisdom, what she has to say. And I have what Miguel Conner, because Freethinker here is mentioning Miguel Conner, who is a great friend and I owe him so much, mentioned that, I come up with this idea, that Mary Magdalene perhaps was Mary the prophetess, which was also known as Mary the alchemist or Mary the Jewess. And there's a whole story in my book about it, how it is possible, although I admit that the evidence is anecdotal. But what I also say, it is that because very often women were not allowed to leave written documentation, the most of information like that comes very often from oral traditions or what other people say. So in this case, it is the famous alchemist from the 3rd century, Zosimos, who is mentioning Mary the prophetess, which incidentally, Zosimos was from Akhmin, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene was also discovered in Akhmin. So, so I'm just making some perhaps radical connections, but I'm looking into what is possible, especially that I personally would love to see Mary Magdalene in Alexandria, especially that there was a group of philosophers in Alexandria called the Therapete, who had a very close connection with the Gnostic group, the Essenes, and they did allow women in that group, women who could teach. So just because I love this part of the story, just to explain that Mary the prophetess or Mary the alchemist specialized what they called in spiritual alchemy. So she was not interested in producing gold from, base metals and so on, but again, using a form of alchemy for spiritual evolution. And there is Zosimos say that the reason why she was allowed to have her own school and teach it widely, because she was a very popular teacher in the 1st century. So she's in the 1st century, and I confirm it in the National Library in Israel from the open source access, that she lived in the 1st century because she was a Jewish, or at least partially Jewish. And in my other research, when I was looking into Catholic writings about Mary Magdalene, different nuns had visions of her and so on, it is often mentioned in these visions that Mary Magdalene was actually of double lineage, which means she was her mother was Jewish, but her father was Egyptian, and apparently he was a part of some Egyptian mystery. So perhaps this thing that is often called New Agey thing, that Mary Magdalene has some connection with Egypt and with the hermeneutical traditions of Egypt, perhaps, there is some truth to this. And I intuitively really love it. And I think that there is something to it. Whether she was actually Mary the prophetess and alchemist, I don't know. But this is just one possibility. And I love this possibility, especially that, this tradition, which again, I thought was very New Agey, that Mary Magdalene went to southern France after the event of resurrection. In these sources, which are medieval sources mostly, but some of them are like as early as 2nd century. And it's especially when it's elaborated much later in the so-called Golden Legend, which was written by a Dominican monk, that Mary Magdalene left for France only 14 years later after the resurrection. So for me, it makes perfect sense that she went to Alexandria in between, because, all the disciples were persecuted, basically, right? So this way she would go to Alexandria, and then if the French story is true, she could still go to France. And as I said, at first I thought that this French story is just just people are claiming different saints all over the world and so on, especially during the Middle Ages. But then I came across a book by a scholar, quite recent book by Anna Fedele, who actually writes about pilgrimages to the shrines of Catholic shrines of Mary Magdalene in Provence. And this is how I discovered that this is a real thing. In Provence, in the southern France, the region of southern France, people really believe, that there is this long-standing tradition of Mary Magdalene. And in fact, they have a relic of woman from the first century, that they claim to be the skull of Mary Magdalene. And a few years ago, National Geographic did the kind of 3D scan of that face, and it shows, how the woman could possibly look, right? So this is very exciting. So I'm also looking into this, as well as so this is the third part, actually, when I talk about France. And there also I look into the Cathars, and many of you already know that the Cathars were the heretics from 12th century, but it is a very interesting story because they were very advanced group spiritually, and they had the group of the so-called perfecti who had to take consolamentum, which means it was like an initiation to be healers, and many of them were women, and many preachers were also women. So we know absolutely nothing or nearly nothing about their beliefs, except that they are somehow close, scholars say, to the Manichaeans, other Gnostic group from the much earlier period. But we found one prayer which mentions Mary, and then the scholar says, oh, that's quite interesting that the prayer mentions Mary, because actually we know for sure that the Cathars didn't think much of Virgin Mary, because she was they said that she's just a physical vessel for Christ to incarnate. So they thought nothing of her. And I thought, why assume that it was a Virgin Mary? Perhaps it was a prayer to Mary Magdalene, who according to also to the Provençal tradition came to France, and she was the first one to teach. And in the Golden Legend, they also say that Mary Magdalene came from a powerful house, and that she was a wise woman, and that's why she started to preach until she retired in a cave there for the last 30 years. So this is part 3. I also briefly discuss Knights Templar, because it's quite interesting, because like the Cathars, by the way, the Templars named many their churches after Mary Magdalene and consecrated them on the Feast of Mary Magdalene, which is traditionally 22nd of July. So there is definitely something to this. So this is part 3, but I think I was a little bit ahead of myself, because I wanted also to come back to part 1, where apart from talking about my own journey towards Eros, and Tantra and the Greek and Hindu goddesses, I also rely heavily on the work of Eva Pierakos and elaborated on this, because I wanted to make a distinction between, sexual and erotic, because according to this distinction, sexual is just kind of very animalistic sex, which is nothing wrong with it, but it will not take you necessarily, to spiritual realms. When she also talks about erotic connection, it is, and how is it different? Erotic connection is really this feeling of, I really know you, or I really want to know you. And although it is also beautiful sexually, it is also this kind of recognition of each other's souls, so to speak. So this is the erotic connection, and this is what sexual alchemy really is about. And I make a distinction between this also and what I call the romantic trap, because in our relationships, especially in our younger, I guess, years, but always really, we can fall into the romantic trap. And how is it different really from sexual alchemy or from erotic connection? So I explained that, and this is just my theory and my own experience, that the romantic trap is basically playing the part of a lover. So it means you always want to, you play with Eros, so you always want to be beautiful. You don't show your ugly parts to each other, whether physical or emotional and spiritual. Why, when we talk about erotic connection, it requires great courage, because you have to fully expose yourself to another. You have to grow spiritually. You have to personally grow spiritually, and the partner has to be willing to grow with you. And so they have to look at each other and themselves as well. So this is basically, this is my soul. It requires full exposure, right? So you show your ugly parts and you show your beautiful parts. When in a romantic trap, it lasts only that long because you wear the mask, the beautiful mask, which is, of course, extremely exciting, but will not lead to to the expansion of consciousness that I was talking to the spiritual growth, and this is what it ultimately is about. And part 4, I'm trying to bring it all together at the end. I go back to the Hindu goddesses and tantric works, especially the Kula ritual, chapter 29, and also Pratabhijana Hridayam and Spandakarikas, and so on. So these are the tantric works from the 10th century, which were written by the disciples of the 10th century philosopher Abhinavagupta, who wrote down these works, which came to him from actually female lineage of tantric goddesses and tantric teachers. One of them was Arda Triambaka, who actually apparently started the sexual part of tantric tradition, non-dualistic tradition. Okay, so she was not only about sexuality, but she thought that through sexual act, when done consciously, we can awaken our Kundalini energy and we can experience the original creation. And in fact, like, we have access to like quantum reality, speaking in modern terms. Her name was Arda Triambaka, and according to mythology, she was a daughter of one of the 3 original sages, right? So it almost sounds like ancient aliens or something, but 3 original sages who came down to planet Earth, and one of them had a daughter called Arda Triambaka. So I always thought that it was interesting that this tradition, which is now very often used to demean women, because many gurus do use women sexually in tantric rituals to expand their own consciousness and then dispose of them, was actually started by a woman, so we can balance our masculine and feminine energy within, through this relationship, through this beautiful play of polarities. And although at the end we have to transcend these polarities, masculine and feminine, first we have to, and this is when I talk about goddess consciousness, first we have to also revive the feminine consciousness, because nowadays I think we go too much in one direction of this kind of technologically minded reasoning, which I call masculine intellect, but it has nothing to do with gender. Okay, we all have it. Like, I bought into this for the most of my part, as most of my life as an academic, right? The masculine mind, and only with this book, really, I started to discover this other part, the feminine part of different form of wisdom, which is more spiral, which is more intuitive, and comes in kind of bursts of satori, or what the Christian theologians called intellection, or Hindu sages called the buddhi, which is the higher mind, the mind that is has nothing to do with cause and effect and Newtonian physics. But I think I'm sidetracking myself here. So we have to bring this, together. We have to transcend these polarities, but first we have to actually understand, develop, and look into this feminine part of our consciousness, because how can we transcend it, the polarity, if we really don't know anything about the second part of this polarity, which is the feminine in us, right? In a case, and again, I'm not talking about gender, but kind of animus and anima division, that we have within ourselves, that Carl Jung was talking about. So this is what I also discuss, as a form of goddess consciousness. So before we can transcend it, we have to discover it and we have to live it. That's why I call it, that's why I call it goddess consciousness. And the reason why I looked into goddesses, and the reason why I talk about sexuality also, is because how can we transcend anything if we don't bring it into the light? And I think what happens to human sexuality, I think that and I write about it a little bit in my book. I don't understand why, but it seems it was completely hijacked, right? Because it is always portrayed in an animalistic kind of way, or in a way to demean sexuality. And although men had much more freedom than women, but they were not taught to honor their sexuality ever. So I think that we have to bring it into light. We have to show the positive side of this and experience this. And I'm sure many of us did, and I did, especially in my tantric experience and right after this. But one of the quotes in my book is exactly about that. It is, "I trust them because they had tasted the fruit." And I'm talking about the goddesses of Eros, and I'm talking about everybody who experience, erotic connection or wants to experience it, because they tasted the truth. How can you bring something to light if you have never tasted it? How can you integrate something if you didn't live it? How can you evolve if you didn't accept your sexual self also? We are both sexual and spiritual beings. And when it happens, I would like to leave you the words from Abhinavagupta, the tantric philosopher, and he talks about sexual union here, "That which produces bliss should be used in worship, since it ravishes the heart. That which produces bliss should be used in worship, since it ravishes the heart." And so this is, I think, really important that we do this, and erotic connection brings us bliss. And at the end of my book, I discuss this legend, tantric legend about goddess Kali. How did she come? And I think it's very timely, actually, because we live in such strange times. So apparently in mythological times, Earth started to be invaded by some demonic entities. And at certain stage, the gods asked goddess Durga to fight these entities that were destroying all that is good on our planet. And she started to fight the demons, but it was just too hard. So out of her third eye, she created goddess Kali, which is her version of herself, the fierce version of herself. And goddess Kali started to kill everyone. And in fact, she did slay all the demons. But at the end, she started to, she was like a Terminator. So she started to slay everyone, including the gods. So she became completely out of control, out of this anger, of what is done to our planet. And then at certain stage, she sees goddess Shiva, who is wounded, and he lies down in a battlefield. But very tantric, he still managed to have his phallus erected, and they join in a sexual union, and with that she transforms into goddess Sundari and brings harmony to the world, because the feminine and masculine is healed and connected and healed through the erotic rapture. So some people find the story really, really funny, but I also think that it is a very telling story. That we have to bring this union. We have to bring these polarities and balance them within ourselves and in our relationships. And the last thing that I would like to mention, unless you have any questions, is that we have to do it. No one else will do it for us. And once, when I still lived in Toronto, I live in Brisbane now, I had this actually coming out of a matrix moment, which lasted only a few seconds. So I was on a tram, and everybody's looking at their mobiles and so on. And suddenly, I'm still sitting on a tram, and I see like I'm out of it, basically. So I'm observing everyone, as if they were in a movie, but I'm outside of the movie. Like I was like creeped out of the movie. And I realized how artificial all of this was, this great kind of Maya that we are playing, that there is some kind of matrix, there is some kind of wheel, that is keeps turning. And momentarily I was out of this, and I was like, by an act of grace, I could be outside of this. And that this creation is quite artificial and fragile at the same time, and that we can change it. We don't have to mindlessly go, through our routines. So I would like to read you the last lines from my book. It is just only 4 lines. But I had this realization at the end of this event when I was on a tram. You are not alone. There is a higher consciousness within you, waiting to erupt with the ecstasy of your being. Don't be afraid. Make the turn. Make the right turn. And by the make the right turn, I mean walking the opposite direction to what everybody else is doing, because we are all kind of to a degree brainwashed, and I don't know why, but there are ways from that, whatever works for you to move in a different direction, so because I believe that we have an endless potential as human species, and somebody's hijacking it. And part of it, was discovering this other consciousness within us, which I called goddess consciousness, but again, it is genderless. It is completely genderless, and it's just energy within us. And part of this is also accepting and celebrating our sexuality, because it is such a big part of us, and sexuality is part of our spirituality. The longer we repress something, the longer we reject something that is so at the core of our being, the longer we delay actually our spiritual evolution. And we really have to evolve. So that's why I say at the end of the book, you're not alone. There's greatness within you, and we just make the turn. Just make the turn. And I think, in a strangest possible way, I make the turn with the book, and it's not because I think the book is great or anything. I just want it to be an entertaining book, as I'm looking with respect at alternative traditions. But somehow writing of this book liberated me from my own madness. By madness, I mean from my own brainwashing. I know that in society we have to wear masks, like, writer, academic, father, mother, whatever you want, right? But that I was a complete slave to two particular narratives. One is the literary world, which is a form of dogma. And as Gnostics, there are some Gnostics here, dogma doesn't have to be like, the dogma of a church. Like, dogma is just something that oppresses you because you buy into this. And the other one was academic, that I have to be an academic. And I always felt imprisoned by this, but I have no guts, to do anything about it, because what Gurdjieff said, I was always internally considering, which means I was always unconsciously, it was completely unconscious, worried what other people think, what would my academic colleagues think, and they probably think I'm mad. I hope that, I never told them about this book. My literary friends who think I lost my mind, I sacrificed my literary career because I'm writing about like some weird alternative stuff and spiritual stuff. But this kind of liberated me, and also liberated me from the desire to, be acknowledged. I just started to have fun. So even now, although I was nervous at the beginning when I was talking to you, simply because it's my first live stream, so I wasn't sure even if I'm on air. So I got a bit stressed at the beginning because of that. I'm just actually having fun, and I just went for it. You know what I mean? I just wrote the book that wanted to be written, and not what anybody thinks. And first part, is extremely personal. I don't think that anyone can expose themselves more than I did, in this book, right? So I allow and it was actually really easy to write this book, believe it or not, because it's really written itself. What was difficult is practicalities of life, right? Because I have family to support. I have like 400 postgraduate students that always want something from me, and fair enough, that's my job and I love them. But just finding time for this. But once you find time for this, and I'm telling to other people who maybe want to write a book or do anything else, it's actually, there's a great reward in it. But it's not that you become famous or you're one on Amazon or something, number one. But it is that you suddenly walked into the stream, like you are in the zone. And perhaps it is the reward that the reward, that you realize that you're part of this really cosmic consciousness, because I don't even know what vocabulary to use for this. So I'll just share at the end here this tantric experience that I had, in which, by the way, I just spontaneously fulfill certain criteria, which are established in chapter 29 of Kula ritual of Tantra Loka. When I had this tantric, which was a sexual experience, and I had, it was an experience of grace, and I have no idea how to repeat it because I'm not a tantric teacher. I called myself spiritual detective, and this is what I am. I actually had an experience of being completely immaterial. I just saw particles of energy, around me, and I realized that this is the grand illusion. The time is the grand illusion. Materiality is the grand illusion. Although I would not give up materiality so easily, because it can be an experience of great pleasure, of great awe, the beauty of nature, or even a beauty of, erotic connection with another. Because if it is done in the right way, and by right way, I say, you open up yourself completely to another being, you cannot get more intimate with someone else, with another soul, and actually realize that, we are one. We're absolutely one as beings, right? And this is one of the most ecstatic ways, I think, that we can experience this oneness. And someone I just want to repeat, although I don't want to sound, like some conspiracy theorist, but someone is consciously hijacking our sexuality, because see how it is portrayed by movie stars, but in Hollywood. See how is it portrayed in by pop stars, especially feminine pop stars. And I know all the, or not all, but many symbolism from the goddesses of Eros, which were here so we can transcend our consciousness, so we can transcend between different dimensions, we can expand our human consciousness, and we're used to demean our sexuality and bring our consciousness lower. So this is not right. That's why I did write this book, to say, look, there is another way of looking at our consciousness, at our sexuality, and our sexuality is a part of our consciousness and is a part of our spirituality. And that's why, some people, a few years ago, I gave a first interview, it was on Eon Byte, on this tantric Mary Magdalene, and somebody says, this woman is horrible, how she can talk about Jesus like that. But I think that Mary Magdalene and Yeshua, or I don't know, Inanna and Dumuzi, or Isis and Osiris, although this is slightly different, some people would disagree, they lived this full sexual alchemy. They were a part of complete union. They did not reject anything, so because they were enlightened beings, right? They were like Hindu avatars, so to speak, right? They came here to help us. And for some reason, whether it is our own consciousness or some outside agenda, they wanted to keep it low. And I think just because of that, we should keep it high. So that's why Krishna and Radha, exactly, Krishna and Radha, and I talk about Radha in my book because everybody loves Radha. She transcends desire through desire. How beautiful is that, right? And she longs for Krishna, and there's this beautiful union, and it's both sexy and it's both spiritual. And I don't see why we even have to have this kind of distinction. So this is just, this is nothing, I didn't cover everything. This is just my experience. This is just my journey, especially part one. And I look into alternative theories of that, right? And try to give it a different spin. And I think the value in the personal experience that I include there is because I did have this experience. It does exist. It's not some, imaginary thing. So if I had it, and I truly believe it was just an act of grace, so I can experience this. Obviously, people like, for example, Mary Magdalene or Yeshua could experience it, and they brought it for us, or Krishna and Radha, or these people. And it's actually quite interesting. I especially look into Christianity and also early mythologies of the West and Hinduism, because how it actually brought me back to Gnosticism and Christianity. The stories are exactly the same. the stories are exactly the same. And in fact, I once wrote in one blog that the Gnostic story of the fall of Sophia and the Hindu story of Shakti is actually the same story, except that one, the Hindu story, talks from the divine about our experience from the divine point of view, which is almost like a amusing play of consciousness, right? When the story of Sophia is the experience of human soul when we are already embodied, and we are lost, and we think like, okay, so I'm divine, but why don't I feel divine? Why I feel like a slave sometimes, right? But it's actually, in whichever tradition you look, it is the same story. So unless you have some questions, I would just really like to thank you for accompanying me on this journey and actually coming here today after, my struggles with technology. And this book is exactly that. I'm just, and it was a great pleasure actually to write it. I'm just trying to bring light to something that always felt full of light for me. But everybody around me, especially in media, seemed to demean it. And we all had experiences that tell us that this is not true, right? That this can be beautiful, and sexuality is a part of our spirit. So with that, I would like to thank you for being here, and you hope, I hope it's not too much of self-promotion, that you get interested in the other goddess in the book and enjoy this journey, because as I said, the book is intended as an entertaining book and not, some kind of academic treatise. So thank you, my friends. If you have no questions, I'll leave you to your evening, I think, because most of the people are here from the United States. And thank you. Thank you once again. If you can, check out my book. I know Todd already ordered it. Thank you, Todd. Thank you so much. No questions? Thank you, Frifinke. Thank you. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Dom. Oh, good to see you, Todd. Thank you. Until next time, Todd, I will speak with you soon. We have a date. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Free think about the dove and its relationship to the Holy Spirit. Yes, so okay, so I actually wrote about it when I was writing about free think. Bye, Todd. When I was writing about Sophia as the goddess of wisdom also. So Holy Spirit is Spiritus Sanctus in Latin, and like many actually mistranslations in the Bible, especially from the original Greek, it was originally, Sophia, which is wisdom. So it was actually translation into Holy Spirit, which in Sophia in Greek is feminine, and Holy Spirit, which is Spiritus Sanctus in Latin, is masculine. So it's almost like a grammatical confusion. So yes, I would consider Holy Spirit feminine, and it makes more sense then, because it brings balance back to what in Christianity is called Trinity. So this is what I would say. Oh, I didn't know it, Frifinke, but it was used a lot in Catholic in Catholic teachings. I actually didn't know it, so thank you. You see, you learn something. That's why I like this kind of interactions, because you always learn something. Thank you. Thank you. Until next time.